"Take it down!" The cry ripped through the night from behind the fence, followed instantly by 3 sharp gunshots splitting the dark. On the other side of my property line, a ragtag crew of fake HOA security officers had their rifles trained on a fleet of rescue helicopters, convinced they were chasing trespassers. They didn't realize those choppers carried people who could upend everything they thought they knew. Above us, one pilot wrestled with the controls, rotor blades wobbling as he fought to keep the machine steady. On the ground, Marlowe Cross commanded her squad like a war-seasoned general, barking orders about defending the neighborhood in the middle of a battle that existed only in her imagination. They had just tangled with forces that even the real cops tended to avoid. Wherever you're watching from, brace yourself. What happened next wasn't far from a nightmare. My name's Jake Whitmore. 3 years ago, I would have sworn the worst thing that could happen to an aerospace engineer was discovering a critical design flaw. I was dead wrong. The real worst thing? Seeing your unmanned rescue drone get hijacked mid-mission while a family of 4 was trapped in a hurricane and then having to tell their loved ones that your so-called bulletproof system failed at the moment they needed it most. That was the day I walked away from Lockheed Martin. I inherited my grandfather's ranch in Millfield County and traded in high-tech avionics for old tractors. For 3 years, life here was quiet and peaceful. Even the biggest disruption was when Mrs. Henderson's cat got stuck in my oak tree. But that peace ended at exactly 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. It started as a faint hum, then grew into the shadow of a metallic dragonfly skimming the stars. I was elbow deep in rewiring an ancient generator in my workshop when the sound stopped me cold. Helicopters weren't unusual out here. Medical flights to Dallas General came through a couple times a month, but this one was different. It was flying dark, no navigation lights, no search beams, just the heavy, unmistakable chop of military-grade rotors slicing through humid summer air. The engineer in me started breaking it down automatically. A twin-engine setup, likely a Black Hawk variant, holding steady around 800 feet and maneuvering like it didn't want to be found. This wasn't a rancher checking cattle, this wasn't a storm-chasing news crew. Then I saw it slung under its belly was a metal container, not a rescue pod or med crate, but something you'd expect to see in a hazmat transport facility. A lead-lined vault that would make a Geiger counter nervous. Even from a distance, the stenciled warning labels on its surface glinted under my shop light. I couldn't read them, but I didn't want to. Whatever was inside, it wasn't here to save Endernia, and it had no business flying over civilian land without clearance. That's when she showed up, Mara Cross. I'd seen her around town for half a year, always in tactical gear, always claiming to be the security coordinator for an HOA that didn't exist in rural ranch country. She carried herself like a career cop, right down to the radio headset and badge that only looked legitimate from 20 feet away. Tonight she wasn't alone. 4 men in matching polo shirts with community security patches flanked her, each armed with what looked a lot like real rifles for a group playing dress-up. "You," she barked, pointing straight at me over the thump of rotor blades. "Step away from the building, hands where I can see them. We're conducting a security sweep of unauthorized aircraft in HOA-protected airspace." The absurdity of that sentence would have been funny if one of her guys wasn't holding an AR-15. HOA-protected airspace. This was rural Texas, not a gated subdivision with a power trip problem. My family had worked this land since 1943, and the only law that mattered here was the county sheriff, who happened to be my fishing partner every other weekend. The pilot, apparently just as baffled by this welcoming committee as I was, dipped lower and popped a flare. The white glare lit up everything of the grim determination on Mara's face, her squad's nervous fidgeting, and the glaring absence of anything remotely official. Their ride was a white Ford Transit van with cheap magnetic door signs you could order online. The flare drifted down like a dying star. Then the helicopter's rotor clipped a power line to my barn. Sparks burst in a cascade of blue and orange, lighting the yard like midday while the pilot fought to stay aloft. That's when I made my first mistake. Instead of calling 911 like a rational person, I walked toward the fence. Old habits from my engineering days, assessing threats, analyzing situations, took over. I wanted to know why these people were shooting at what was obviously a federal aircraft. "Ma'am," I called, keeping my voice steady despite my heart pounding like a jackhammer. "I'll need to see some ID and understand what authority you think you have. This is private land, and you're targeting a federal operation." Her answer was to press her radio and speak in clipped, confident tones that might have sounded professional if the words weren't completely insane. "Control, this is Team Leader Cross. The package is in the restricted zone as expected. Subject on the ground shows signs of non-compliance and potential collaboration, requesting permission to escalate to Protocol Red." The way she said control made my stomach turn. Someone was actually answering her. These people had a network enough to track aircraft and coordinate in real time. A male voice crackled back with what sounded like coded confirmation. Meanwhile, the pilot had stabilized and was hovering about 50 feet up, rotor wash whipping the dirt into a miniature dust storm. Through the cockpit glass, I could see him clearly, a young, sharp, furious. He was speaking into his headset, probably calling for backup or demanding an explanation for why his flight had turned into a war zone. Then the chopper's loudspeakers came alive. "Ground units, this is Federal Flight 77 Alpha, operating under Emergency Management Directive 1427. Cease all hostile actions immediately and clear the area. Continued interference will result in federal charges." The co-pilot, it seemed, was willing to give diplomacy a shot. Before the situation could calm down, Mara Cross doubled down. She pressed her radio again, her tone now laced with an icy conviction that could make any sane person uneasy. "The package is federal surveillance," she announced. "They're mapping our defenses and logging resistance points. Activating Red Protocol. All units, prepare for Phase 2. I stood in the fading glow of the flare, caught between a federal helicopter and a self-styled neighborhood militia that had clearly gone off the rails. For 3 years, I'd done everything possible to avoid the fallout of tech disasters, and now here I was, wedged between a government mission I didn't understand and a civilian force that might be even more dangerous than whatever was inside that sealed crate. This wasn't random. Mara had known the aircraft would come. She'd placed her people exactly where they needed to be, and she was following a plan that somehow included me, whether I was meant to be a roadblock or a tool. The helicopter's rotors shifted pitch, readying to depart. That's when Mara made the call that would haunt both of us for months. She spoke into her headset with calm certainty. "Control, package is exiting the restricted zone. Red Protocol is active. Phase 2 begins at 0600 hours. Then she turned to me with a smile that carried more threat than warmth. "Mr. Whitmore, you've officially been marked as a security risk. I hope you're ready for what comes next." Morning in Millfield County arrived like a slap, and with it came proof that Mara hadn't been bluffing. I woke to the sound of diesel engines and power tools, usually the sign of a neighbor fixing a fence or a tractor. This wasn't one of those mornings. From my bedroom window, I saw men in those same community security polos setting up a temporary checkpoint at my driveway. Not a gate, not a simple roadblock, an actual checkpoint with orange cones, a folding table, and a clipboard. One of them was reading like it held classified intel. I pulled on my boots, coffee in hand, and stepped onto the porch. "Morning. Care to explain why you're on my property without permission?" One of the combat firma suggested I remain inside while they completed a security assessment. That's when I spotted the cameras, black, professional-grade units on telescoping poles, aimed at every approach to my home, my workshop, and, disturbingly, the sky above. These weren't cheap gadgets from a hardware store. They had wireless transmitters, infrared sensors, and the price tag to match. Someone had invested serious time and money to turn my ranch into a surveillance HOA, and they'd done it without me noticing. When I tried to call the sheriff, my landline was dead. Not storm damage, not a frayed wire, electronically dead, as if someone had shut it down on purpose. My cell still showed full bars but refused to connect, flashing a network maintenance error I'd never seen before. Technical glitch? Maybe, but more likely, someone was actively jamming me. I decided to drive into town and deal with this properly. The checkpoint crew stopped me. Voluntary protective custody, they called it. pending the resolution of the incident. When I pointed out that voluntary custody is a contradiction in terms and that they had zero legal grounds to hold me, the man with the clipboard smiled and handed me a business card. Millfield Community Defense Association. Operations Coordinator, Mara Cross. The phone number, a 555 prefix, probably rang straight to nowhere. By afternoon, the absurd turned dangerous. A local news van rolled up to the checkpoint, and Marin, now in a mock military uniform adorned with campaign ribbons, I doubted she'd earned it, held a press conference. She spoke like she'd been rehearsing for weeks, telling the cameras that vigilant citizens had uncovered suspicious federal activity over residential areas and were taking steps to protect the public from undisclosed surveillance programs. The reporter, young and bored, recorded every word as Mara claimed last night's helicopter carried radioactive cargo. From my distance, I couldn't tell what kind of detector she'd used, if any, but she waved it around like it was proof, convincing enough for someone who didn't know better. And that scared me more than the checkpoint or the cameras. That evening, while inspecting my property lines, I found something worse. Tommy Rodriguez's truck parked behind my barn. Tommy, the electrician who'd helped me rewire my workshop just last month. A folded note was tucked under the wiper. Tucked under the windshield wiper was a folded note. Jake, found something you need to see. Meet me at Murphy's Diner tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Don't use your phone. The handwriting was unmistakably Tommy Rodriguez, precise, careful, though the urgency was out of character for a man whose biggest concerns usually revolved around wire gauges and breaker loads. Following his warning, I took a slow walk around my property to think things over. That's when I saw them. Small metallic objects, buried at neat intervals, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Thin, hair-like wires ran between them just under the soil, forming a hidden grid that spanned most of my land. My engineering background recognized the design instantly. Advanced electronic sensors. But these weren't simple motion detectors. They were built to capture acoustic signatures, meaning someone had been recording not just my movements, but my conversations. A broken bar, even calls made from inside my home. This wasn't a slapdash militia stunt triggered by last night's helicopter. This was a coordinated operation, planned, resourced, and implemented well in advance. Someone had been watching me for weeks, maybe months, studying my patterns and waiting for a trigger event. The only question, was I the target, or just unlucky enough to be in the middle of their play? As I stood in the yard staring up at the same stars that had witnessed last night's chaos, a faint whine drifted down from above. Turbine engine, high altitude, too dark to see, but I knew something was up there, and whatever it was could probably read my license plate from miles away. A thin red beam swept my property for exactly 3 seconds, tagging a spot near my front door before vanishing. Someone had just marked my location. Murphy's Diner at 7 a.m. smelled like coffee strong enough to wake the dead, with a side of small-town gossip. Tommy was already there, hunched over a cup, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. I'd known him 2 years, long enough to know he was the type to rewire a barn in a thunderstorm without losing his grin. But today, his hands trembled as he stirred sugar into cold coffee. "Jake, I've got to show you something, but not here," he said, scanning the diner like Mara Cross herself might be hiding behind the pie case. He told me that while finishing a job at the Hendricks place the night before, he'd seen something buried on my land, something the so-called HOA crew wasn't talking about. He showed me a photo on his phone, and my stomach turned. Half buried in my pasture was a sleek electronic device, about the size of a cigarette pack. We left without another word. At his truck, Tommy opened the toolbox to reveal not just the device from the photo, but 3 more identical units, several feet of fiber optic cable, and a small satellite dish. "They're all connected," he explained, his electrician's mind working as he pointed out the wiring. "This isn't basic surveillance, Jake, it's a communications hub. Your ranch is part of a relay network. I'd bet good money they've got more of these all over the county." The realization hit me like a gut punch. This wasn't just about the helicopter. It never was. Someone had been using my land as a data transmission point for months. Whether Mars people had built it or just hijacked it was still unclear. Tommy drove us to a hilltop overlooking the valley, where his truck's radio rig picked up emergency channels for his side business. That's where he spotted something else, what looked like a child's kite about a mile away, moving with unnatural precision. It wasn't drifting in the wind, it held a fixed altitude and path, tethered to someone on the ground who was carefully maneuvering it. As we watched, it dipped slightly and released a small object that floated down like a leaf. "Third drop this morning," Tommy said. "Kites fly low, stay under radar, and don't make noise. To anyone watching, it's just a hobby, but it's a great way to move small packages undetected." Through his binoculars, I saw that this was no toy. It had a compact 2-inch and a payload release system. We drove toward the drop zone and found the package tangled in a fence half a mile from my property. Inside a waterproof pouch was a high-resolution satellite photo of my ranch overhead, marked with pinpoint GPS coordinates. The image wasn't just sharp, it was detailed enough to show every fence post. Even worse, it revealed heat signatures from underground installations invisible to the naked eye. The buried cables and sensors were far more widespread than Tommy had guessed, forming a network that extended well beyond my land into the surrounding area. On the back of the photograph, written in neat block letters, a broken bar. The note, tucked under my windshield wiper, read, "Jake, I found something you need to see. Murphy's Diner. Tomorrow. 7 a.m. Don't use your phone." Tommy's neat handwriting was unmistakable, but the urgency in his words was unlike him. Normally, his biggest concern involved wire gauges or circuit breakers, not cryptic warnings. Taking his advice to heart, I wandered the property to clear my head and weigh my options. That's when I spotted tiny metallic objects buried at precise intervals, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Hair-thin wires connected them, forming a hidden grid that stretched over most of my ranch. My engineering background told me these weren't simple motion sensors. They were sophisticated acoustic detectors capable of capturing not just footsteps, but conversations, even phone calls made inside my house. It hit me this wasn't a hasty militia setup reacting to some stray helicopter sighting. This was a calculated operation, developed over weeks or months. Someone had been monitoring me, learning my patterns, and preparing for exactly what went down last night. The only question was whether I'd been singled out or if I was simply unlucky enough to be in the blast radius of their plan. Either way, I was standing in the middle of a high-tech surveillance net run by people who were either dangerously obsessed or backed by serious resources. As I gazed up at the same stars that had witnessed last night's chaos, a faint sound reached me, the distant whine of a turbine at high altitude. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, likely bristling with cameras sharp enough to read my license plate from miles up. Then a thin red laser swept across my yard for exactly 3 seconds, marking a spot near my front door before vanishing. Someone was tracking me, someone was listening, and someone had just tagged my location for reasons I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Murphy's Diner the next morning smelled of burnt coffee and frying bacon, the kind of place where gossip traveled faster than the food. Tommy was already there, hunched over a mug like he hadn't slept. I'd known him for 2 years, ever since he'd helped rewire my barn, and I'd never seen his hand shake before. "Jake, I've got something to show you. But not here," he said, glancing around like Mara Cross might pop out from behind the pie case. "Last night, finishing the job at the Hendricks place, I saw something, a broken bar off. What's buried on your land isn't anything the HOA's talking about." He showed me a photo of an advanced electronic device, no bigger than a cigarette pack, half dug out of what looked like my back pasture. Out at his truck, he opened the toolbox to reveal the device plus 3 more lengths of fiber optic cable, and what looked like a miniature satellite dish. "All connected," Tommy explained, his electrician's precision evident in the labeled wires. "This isn't just spying, it's a communications hub. And I'd bet there are more setups like this across the county." The realization hit me hard that this wasn't about the helicopter, at least not entirely. My ranch had been turned into part of a larger communications network, likely operating for months. Whether Mara's people installed it or stumbled onto it was still unclear. We drove to a hill where Tommy had his truck's radio gear set up for his side gig monitoring emergency channels. That's where I saw what looked like a child's kite a mile away, except it moved with mechanical precision, tethered to someone carefully controlling it. We watched as it descended slightly and released a small object that floated down like a leaf. "Third time today," Tommy said. "They're using kites to drop packages, avoids radar, keeps quiet, and if anyone asks, they're just out for some fun." Through binoculars, I could see it was no toy. It had a winch system and a payload drop mechanism. We found the package snagged in a fence near my property. Inside, in a waterproof pouch, was a high-resolution satellite photo of my ranch marked with exact GPS coordinates. The detail was stunning, showing not only fence posts but also heat signatures of underground structures invisible from the ground. The buried network was far bigger than Tommy had guessed, covering much of the surrounding area. On the back, in careful block letters, was a message: Dr. E. Vasquez, a Geospatial Analysis Division. "You're not alone. They've been watching 15 communities. Meet tonight, Old Miller Bridge. 11 p.m. Come alone." Dr. Vasquez's tone turned urgent. "They know I'm here," she said, glancing at her watch. The kite system we'd used to communicate had already been compromised, and she'd been under surveillance since yesterday. In roughly 4 hours, she warned, they would initiate something called Phase 2, an operation aimed at eliminating anyone who could obstruct their plans for expansion. That meant both of us, along with anyone else who had started to piece together the truth. From what she'd uncovered, Phase 2 wasn't limited to our area. It involved synchronizing with similar factions in other states, testing how effectively they could intercept federal aircraft and detain civilian witnesses. The endgame was more than just avoiding prosecution for the helicopter incident. It was a demonstration of their ability to control the flow of information and push back against federal authority in rural regions where law enforcement was either in on it or simply outmatched. Our conversation was cut short by the unmistakable sound of engines closing in from multiple directions. Headlights slashed through the darkness like search beams. Vasquez seized my arm and hurried us down into the dry creek bed under the bridge. There, hidden in the shadows, we watched a convoy of trucks and SUVs fan out to secure the area. "This is why I had to meet you in person," she whispered, producing what looked like a military-grade radio. "Federal teams have been staged near your property since earlier today, waiting for confirmation of the threat." The next moments played out like something from an action film I had no desire to star in. Vasquez spoke rapidly into her radio, using codes I didn't understand but which clearly signaled go to whoever was listening. Soon, the air throbbed with the sound of helicopter rotors. Not one this time, A3, converging from different angles, searchlights blazing and loudspeakers declaring federal authority in a tone that dared anyone to challenge it. The militia trucks that had boxed us in began scrambling, their drivers realizing they'd been caught in a carefully orchestrated federal trap. Over the comms, I heard Maracross barking orders to implement protocol. Read a chilling phrase that amounted to eliminating all witnesses. From our hiding place, we watched federal agents drop from helicopters onto my land, moving with night vision precision while the militia stumbled around with flashlights, clinging to their wannabe commando fantasies. The whole thing had been meticulously planned, with contingencies ready for exactly this kind of escalation. Then Vasquez leaned close, her voice barely cutting through the rotor noise. "Jakey, a broken bar. You weren't chosen at random. 3 years ago, when your drone system was hacked and that family was killed, that wasn't an accident. It was a trial run for the same tech buried under your ranch. They've been watching you since, waiting to see how you'd react when the fight came to you." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. My personal tragedy was now tied directly to a sprawling conspiracy, one that had destroyed my career, taken innocent lives, and used me as part of a calculated, years-long plan. I wasn't just caught in the crossfire, I had been the target all along. When boots hit my front porch at 3:47 a.m., I knew the night wasn't over. We'd made it back to my ranch just as federal agents locked down the main house, their night vision gear turning the darkness into a glowing green tactical scene. I didn't expect to see Deputy Mills, my easygoing fishing buddy, directing the whole operation with the precision of someone who'd been prepping for this raid for months. "Good to see you still breathing, Jake," Mills called. "We've been tracking Mars people all night. Your friend here was spot on. Everything she said was here. We found." He gestured toward my barn, now transformed into a makeshift federal command post. Banks of monitors displayed live feeds from across multiple states, all tied to the same kind of underground cabling Tommy had dug up earlier. What I saw on those screens was staggering: dozens of towns with identical systems, all reporting to centralized servers housed in what looked more like a corporate campus than a government facility. This wasn't just some rogue branch of the feds, it was far more calculated. Agent Sarah Chen, the helicopter pilot from the night before, who turned out to be a seasoned investigator, was at a workstation, sifting through the data. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "this is unlike anything we've seen in domestic surveillance. Somebody's built a private intelligence network with federal tech and civilian cover groups, then tested it to see if they could sidestep federal oversight entirely." The central servers were registered to the Millfield Community Development Corporation, a seemingly harmless company buying up rural Texas properties under the guise of economic growth projects. But as federal accountants dug into the funding, the money trail led to a web of shell corporations and, ultimately, to Meridian Security Solutions, a private military contractor operating in a dozen countries with an eyebrow-raising client roster. "This," Vasquez said grimly, pulling up connection charts linking Meridian to various government agencies, "is where it gets complicated." The files revealed something even more alarming: a covert initiative to outsource domestic surveillance to private contractors. At some point, key figures in Washington concluded that conventional law enforcement was too sluggish and too constrained by constitutional safeguards to address emerging internal threats. Their solution was to bring in Meridian Security Solutions to design alternative strategies, leveraging civilian volunteers and off-the-shelf tech. But Meridian had its own agenda. Using the pilot program as camouflage, they began expanding a private intelligence framework they could market to the highest bidder. The network of neighborhood watch groups, HOA security patrols, and armed community defense units wasn't built to aid federal agencies, it was designed to replace them, operating without the constraints of law. Mara Cross's personnel file told its own story. 18 months earlier, Meridian had pinpointed her as an ideal candidate, someone with the right technical skill set and the psychological profile to manage a civilian spy network. Her firing from airport security, not due to incompetence or extremist ties, but engineered by Meridian to sever her trust in official channels. They wanted someone disillusioned, someone who'd feel driven to do it better. The brilliance of the scheme, Mills explained, was using real local fears about federal intrusion as cover for something far worse. Many like Mar genuinely believed they were shielding their communities from government surveillance, never realizing they were installing a far more invasive, privately controlled system. Across 7 states, simultaneous raids were underway at 17 sites, aimed at halting what Meridian called Option Zero, a full activation of their network and the elimination of anyone capable of exposing it. Intercepted transmissions pegged the launch for 6 a.m., giving federal forces less than 2 hours to dismantle a machine that had been quietly built over more than 3 years. Worse yet, the network wasn't just collecting intelligence, it was actively undermining legitimate operations. Hidden devices in the underground grid could jam federal comms, spoof GPS, even hijack aircraft navigation. The helicopter takedown from the previous night, a controlled trial run in an area where they owned the local response. Then Agent Chen unearthed something that froze my blood, a priority neutralization list. My name sat right at the top. The file contained in-depth psychological assessments, my family history, finances, and something called an exploitation timeline, mapping the calculated dismantling of my career and the engineered isolation that had driven me out here. The drone hack 3 years ago hadn't been random. It was designed to shatter me mentally, to force me somewhere they could monitor and manipulate. They've been grooming this for years, Dr. Vasquez said, her tone split between grim respect and disgust. They find technically skilled people who could identify their systems, crush their careers, and funnel them into controlled zones. You're not the only one, JK. There are at least 40 more just like you. While agents prepped to hit Meridian's hubs, I couldn't stop thinking about the family that died because of my drone. I had carried that guilt alone, believing it was my hubris that caused their deaths. Now I knew it had been orchestrated, a move in a psychological war to erase any potential opposition to a surveillance program so extreme it made conspiracy theories look quaint. And the cruelest truth? Mara Cross herself was as much a pawn as any of us. She truly thought she was defending her home from federal tyranny, unaware she was helping create a system that made such tyranny seem merciful by comparison. Meridian's masterstroke was weaponizing genuine fears to hide something far worse, a private panopticon with no accountability. At 5:23 a.m., just 37 minutes before Option 0, Agent Chen handed me a secure phone. On the line was a voice I knew instantly, Amara's. Sirens wailed in the background. "They lied to me, Jake," she said, stripped of the hardened command she'd worn for months. "Meridian never wanted to protect anyone. We were building a control grid that makes authoritarian regimes look amateur." In the minutes that followed, her story spilled out, a textbook case of manipulation and corporate espionage. She'd been approached a year and a half ago by what she thought was a grassroots coalition, Citizens for Community Defense. They warned her of an impending federal crackdown on rural America, complete with secret plans for martial law. According to them, patriots needed to form resistance cells equipped with cutting-edge surveillance to shield their communities from overreach. "They even showed me classified docs," Mara said, her voice faltering as the betrayal sank in. Documents outlining alleged plans to seize private land, move rural residents into cities, and deploy military forces in small towns. Mara's voice cracked as she continued, telling me about the so-called classified reports she had been shown. They had the seals, the confidential stamps, every detail looked authentic. She truly believed she was defending her town from a creeping dictatorship. In reality, she'd been helping to build the very system she thought she was fighting. What struck me most was how completely Meridian had weaponized her patriotism and her genuine distrust of unchecked government power. They had given her legitimate surveillance hardware, real data on aircraft patterns, and actual authority to organize community defense groups. The only fabrication had been their purpose. Rather than shielding citizens from federal oppression, they were laying the groundwork for a private spy network, one they could sell to whoever paid the most. Chen took over the call and pinned down her position, a Meridian site 20 miles north of my ranch, where executives were frantically loading servers and staff into convoys before the feds could move in. That site, she revealed, controlled master systems for surveillance grids across 43 states, plus backup hubs for overseas clients and nations with looser privacy laws. Chen turned to me, his face set with the kind of gravity that meant my quiet exile was about to end. "Meridian's setup," he explained, "was built to dodge government shutdown attempts by instantly shifting control to redundant servers when interference was detected. But Dr. Vasquez had spotted a flaw. The system depended on its original node network to keep those servers in sync. The plan was simple in theory and dangerous in execution: rewire the buried monitoring gear on my land so it would act as a massive amplifier, flooding the entire network with a feedback storm that would knock it out from the inside. To do that, I'd have to stay put while coordinated raids hit backup sites nationwide." Vasquez didn't sugarcoat the risk. Meridian already knew about the federal crackdown. They'd been eavesdropping on government chatter since yesterday. If I agreed, my ranch would become a target for the next 2 hours. I thought about the family who'd died 3 years ago because of Meridian's manipulation, the dozens of others they had broken and isolated, and the communities duped into building their own prison grids. It wasn't really a decision. "Tell me what to do," I said, heading for my workshop where Tommy's dug-up surveillance gear still covered the bench. The next hour became a crash course in electronic warfare, taught by federal agents who treated dense technical manuals like bedtime stories. With Tommy's equipment and extra hardware from Chen's team, we converted my barn into a broadcasting station capable of jamming every synchronization frequency Meridian used. At precisely 6 o'clock a.m.a. the moment Option 0 was set to launch, I flipped the switch. Every buried device on my land roared to life, blasting out maximum signal on all channels at once. The feedback surged through their network like a purpose-built virus. Reports came in within minutes: servers collapsing, comms failing, escape routes compromised by the very tech they had installed to control others. Then Mars' voice cut through the static, triumphant. "Jake, it's working. The whole thing is falling apart. They're locked in their own building as the systems trapped them." But Meridian wasn't going quietly. As their infrastructure failed, they triggered what Chen called a scorched earth order to wipe every trace of their operations and silence anyone who might testify. Intercepts showed a strike team heading straight for my ranch to destroy the signal source and remove all witnesses. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 3 years of running from the fallout of my own technological mistakes, I was now wielding those same tools to dismantle the people who had ruined me. Their surveillance grid, built to watch and cage me, had become my weapon to end them. Across the country, 43 networks were going dark, hundreds of Meridian staff were in custody, and thousands of citizens were about to learn that their fears about surveillance had been righted, just aimed at the wrong culprit. Then Vasquez's voice broke my focus. "One more thing, Jake," she said, with a tone I couldn't quite place. "There's a reason this mission is personal for me, too." She turned toward the window, watching the Texas sunrise paint the horizon in fiery gold before continuing. "My full name is Dr. Elena Vasquez Whitmore," she said quietly. "I've been working in the shadows for 3 years, trying to bring down the people who destroyed our family." I barely had time to process her words before the low growl of approaching engine signaled Meridian's final desperate move. 3 black SUVs barreled toward my ranch, the kind that looked like they belonged in a presidential motorcade. But whatever precision their operators prided themselves on dissolved the moment they realized they'd driven straight into a carefully orchestrated federal ambush. Agent Chen's team had been positioned using Meridian's own surveillance wave, turning their prized system into a weapon against them. The clash was short and decisive. Months later, I'd read in the federal after-action report that Meridian's hit team had expected to find a single frightened civilian engineer holed up behind a barn. Instead, they ran headfirst into a full tactical unit with air support and enough electronic warfare capability to black out a small city. By the end, a dozen Meridian operatives were in custody, their servers were in FBI hands, and coordinated raids on their headquarters were underway in multiple states. 2 hours later, Elena, my sister, whose existence I'd been unaware of for 35 years, had told me the truth. She had infiltrated the intelligence community for the sole purpose of dismantling the people who had targeted our family. The drone attack that destroyed a family and ended my career had been more than a technology test, it was vengeance. Our father had refused to sell his aerospace patents to the predecessors of Meridian, costing them millions in potential defense contracts. They'd spent decades trying to erase his legacy by corrupting his work and destroying his children's lives. Meridian's reach was staggering. They hadn't just targeted us, they had systematically identified engineers, analysts, and scientists across the country who might one day threaten their empire. Each victim was driven into isolation through finely tuned psychological warfare. My rural exile had been just one example of their perfected playbook. Mara Cross's case was one of the most heartbreaking. Her deep patriotism and legitimate fears about government power had been turned into a tool for building the very kind of tyranny she thought she was preventing. When the executives manipulating her were arrested, the realization shattered her. Justice came fast. Within months, dozens of Meridian leaders and operatives were convicted on charges from domestic terrorism to conspiracy to commit murder. Their assets were seized, their contracts shredded, and their surveillance networks dismantled. The technology was locked away under federal control so it could never again be used on U.S. citizens. For me, vindication arrived in the form of a congressional hearing where I testified about Meridian's manipulation tactics. The family destroyed by the drone hack received a settlement of money that could never bring them back, but could offer some security to those left behind. New laws soon required strict oversight of any domestic surveillance program, public or private. Half a year later, I accepted the role of Director of Community Security at the Department of Homeland Security, ensuring no community would face what mine had. Ironically, the same technical skills Meridian tried to erase now protected others. Elena and I rebuilt our relationship, remembering our parents' dreams for us. Together, we founded an organization to help families targeted by corporate surveillance schemes, offering both financial aid and technical defense. Mara served her sentence, then dedicated herself to teaching others about the dangers of manipulation and disinformation. She sent me a letter, apologizing for the harm she caused and thanking me for helping reveal the truth. This morning, I stood on my porch watching a legitimate rescue helicopter circle overhead during a training drill. I thought about my journey from victim, to survivor, to protector. Justice may be slow, but when it comes, it can strike with the speed of rotor blades cutting through a clear Texas sky. Jake's story is proof that the gravest dangers often come dressed as protection and that ordinary people can become the shield for their communities when they refuse to be silent.